He bought an old rusty container and moved into it, becoming the laughingstock of the whole neighborhood. But after a while, curiosity got the better of them. The neighbors peeked inside and were shocked by what they saw. Subscribe and write where you're watching from. The cold February wind swept through the streets of the city as Marcus walked with his shoulders hunched, his worn coat pulled tightly around him. It was the same coat he had owned for years, the same one that had once been enough to shield him from the chill when life was better. Now it felt like little more than a thin layer of fabric between him and the world that had grown colder in more ways than one. He moved slowly, not because he had nowhere to be, but because there was nowhere worth rushing to. Only 2 years ago, his days had been filled with the steady hum of welding machines, the smell of hot steel, and the satisfaction of a job well done. He had been one of the most reliable workers at the auto repair and fabrication shop, known for his meticulous craftsmanship and quiet determination. His hands, rough and scarred from years of labor, had built custom gates, repaired cracked chassis, and reshaped battered frames into functional works of art. Customers trusted him. Colleagues respected him. He had a modest home in a quiet neighborhood, a small backyard where he grew vegetables in neat rows, and a few close friends who shared his love of fishing on the weekends. Life had never been extravagant, but it had been stable, and stability was a kind of wealth Marcus valued deeply. Then came the series of blows that dismantled everything. The first was the slowdown in work. Contracts drying up, orders shrinking. Management tried to hold on as long as they could, but eventually the layoffs began. Marcus's position wasn't spared. At first, he thought he could find another job quickly. He had skills, experience, and a strong work ethic, but every interview ended the same way. "We'll be in touch," followed by silence. His mother's illness came next, swift and merciless. The hospital visits became more frequent, the bills piling up faster than he could keep track. He sold tools, his fishing gear, even the second-hand pickup truck he'd maintained for years, just to cover another month's rent or another round of medication. The night she passed away, he sat beside her bed holding her frail hand, feeling the final warmth leave her fingers. The grief hollowed him out. He returned to his small house alone, and it felt unbearably empty. The bank notices began to arrive soon after. The savings he had left went into trying to keep the house, but the numbers didn't work. One morning, an envelope arrived with the final warning. 2 weeks later, the locks were changed, and Marcus stood on the curb with his life reduced to a few duffel bags. He spent the next months drifting between cheap motels, spare couches, and, more often, park benches when there was no other option. The friends who had once been part of his life seemed to vanish when his luck did. Calls went unanswered, messages ignored. One gray afternoon, as he wandered the outskirts of the industrial district looking for temporary work, he spotted a figure he recognized, a former colleague from the fabrication shop. They greeted each other with cautious warmth, two men who understood without words how quickly life could unravel. The man mentioned in passing that the shipping yard nearby was clearing out old marine containers, selling them for almost nothing to anyone willing to haul them away. Marcus almost laughed at the absurdity of it. A man without a job, without steady income, buying a rusted steel box. Yet the thought lingered. That night, lying on the thin mattress of a rundown motel room, Marcus turned the idea over in his mind. It was ridiculous, yes, but it was also something. It would be his. Not a bed borrowed in a stranger's spare room, not a bench under the indifferent glare of a street light. His. a place where no one could tell him to leave. A shell, perhaps, but one that could hold the scraps of dignity he had left. The next morning, he walked to the shipping yard. The air was thick with the smell of rust and oil, and rows of containers stood like silent sentinels, their paint faded, their surfaces pitted and scarred. Some were dented, others bore the ghostly outlines of logos long since worn away. The man in charge showed him a unit near the back. The steel doors groaned as they swung open, revealing a cavernous interior lined with peeling paint and the faint scent of salt water and decay. It was dark, cold, and empty, yet in that emptiness Marcus felt a strange spark, a stubborn flicker of possibility. The price was low, lower than Marcus had expected, but it was still nearly everything he had left. He hesitated only once, picturing the motel room, the endless shuffling between temporary shelters. Then he reached into his pocket, counted the bills with calloused fingers, and handed them over. The container was his now, for better or worse. He paid a small fee to have it delivered to a vacant lot on the edge of town, a forgotten stretch of land beside abandoned warehouses and overgrown rail tracks. The truck driver maneuvered the container into place, the heavy thud echoing as it settled on the uneven ground. The driver gave Marcus a curious glance before leaving, as if silently questioning what anyone would want with a rusted metal box in a place like this. Standing alone beside it, Marcus ran his hand along the cold steel wall. The surface was rough beneath his fingertips, the paint flaking away in thin curls. Inside, the air was stale, and each footstep rang with a hollow echo. This was not a home. Not yet. That night, he laid his sleeping bag on the bare metal floor. The wind slipped through the narrow gap where the doors met, carrying with it the damp bite of winter. He pulled his coat tight, curled into himself, and listened to the creaks and groans of the container settling in the night air. Sleep came in brief, uneasy bursts. Dreams carried him back to warmer days, his mother's voice calling him in for supper, the scent of fresh cornbread, the chatter of friends gathered around a table. He woke before dawn, the light just beginning to bleed into the gray sky, and sat up, his breath a pale mist in the frigid air. Around him was nothing but rusted walls and the scattered belongings from his bags. He felt the weight of silence pressing in, the stillness broken only by the distant cry of a train whistle. Yet, as he stood and looked toward the east, the rising sun caught the side of the container, turning the battered steel a warm copper. In that brief light, Marcus imagined what could be. The thought was fragile, almost foolish, but it was enough to keep him from turning away. He didn't know how, or when, or with what resources, but he knew he couldn't let this be just another place he passed through on the way to nowhere. This was going to be different. And with that thought, the first seed of resolve took root. The container might be nothing more than a shell now, but he had seen it, just for a moment, become something more in the light of the morning sun. He didn't realize it then, but this battered steel box, sitting alone on an empty lot, would be the start of the hardest, most transformative chapter of his life. The following days settled into a strange rhythm, if it could be called that. Marcus woke early, sometimes before the sun had fully broken the horizon, the inside of the container still dark except for the faintest leak of light through the narrow gap in the doors. The mornings were coldest, the kind of cold that made his breath billow in the air like smoke and forced him to sit still for a moment, gathering the will to move. The hard steel beneath him seemed to hold the night's chill, and when he rose, every joint ached from sleeping on a thin mat directly on the metal floor. It was far from comfort, but it was shelter, and he clung to that fact as a small victory. He began venturing into the nearby streets, partly to search for discarded items he might use, partly to keep from going stir-crazy in the echoing emptiness of the container. The area was a patchwork of faded warehouses, chain-link fences topped with sagging barbed wire, and lots overrun with weeds. Here and there, older houses leaned against each other as if time and neglect had made them weary. It wasn't the kind of neighborhood where people stopped to talk to strangers, and Marcus quickly realized that his presence had not gone unnoticed. On the third day after settling in, he caught a group of teenagers lingering near the lot, pointing toward the container and laughing. Their voices carried in the cold air each sharp burst of laughter like a jab to the ribs. They didn't speak directly to him at first, but the tone was unmistakable. Mockery disguised as casual banter. Later that week, he saw two men from a nearby auto yard pause to watch him from across the street as he wrestled with the stiff hinges of the container's doors. One shook his head and muttered something to the other, and both chuckled before walking away. The ridicule didn't stay confined to the street. One afternoon, returning from a walk, Marcus found a young man crouched across the road, holding a phone aimed squarely at the container. The man didn't move when Marcus approached. He just kept filming, grinning as if capturing a piece of absurd street theater. By the following day, Marcus understood why. At a nearby convenience store, while paying for a packet of instant noodles, he heard his container described in vivid detail by two customers behind him. They laughed about the guy living in a shipping box, speculating on whether he had to curl up like a sardine to sleep. When Marcus turned slightly, he caught sight of an image on one of their phones, a wide-angle shot of his container sitting on the lot, its rust stains and dents fully exposed, captioned with a line meant to be clever but dripping with ridicule. The photo had been posted on a local community page and was already attracting mocking comments. The sting of it was sharper than he expected. He had never been a man obsessed with what people thought of him, but there was something different about being the subject of public derision, about having strangers sum you up in a glance and declare you a joke. He tried to tell himself it didn't matter, but the truth was that it gnawed at him, especially in the quiet hours of night when the wind rattled the container's frame and the darkness pressed close. Food became a practical problem. With no refrigerator and no real place to cook, his meals were reduced to what could be bought cheaply and stored without spoiling, mostly canned goods, bread, and the occasional piece of fruit when he could find it on sale. Eating became a functional task, something to stave off hunger rather than a source of pleasure. The cold inside the container made even that simple act feel wearying, as though the air itself sapped the warmth from every bite. As the first week turned into the second, the weather grew harsher. The wind off the rail yard carried a dampness that seeped into his bones, and at night the temperature dropped enough to coat the interior metal walls with a thin layer of condensation. In the mornings, tiny droplets hung from the ceiling like an inverted rain, and any movement would send them falling in a cold sprinkle over his bedding. His breath left pale clouds that lingered in the air, and the thin mat beneath him offered no barrier against the unyielding floor. The loneliness was its own kind of cold. The container was silent most of the time, save for the occasional groan of shifting metal or the dull clang of something striking its exterior, usually a stray branch carried by the wind or, more than once, a deliberate knock from someone passing by. Marcus began to anticipate those knocks, not because he welcomed them, but because they reminded him he wasn't invisible, even if the attention was almost always unwanted. Sometimes at night he would hear muffled voices outside, followed by quick bursts of laughter, and he knew they were talking about him. Once, early in the morning, he found a crude drawing scrawled on the side of the container in chalk, a stick figure inside a rectangle with exaggerated frown lines. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his coat, but the faint outline remained, like a shadow of the mockery itself. Still, there were moments when his mind would wander toward the possibility of change. He would catch himself staring at the walls, imagining them lined with wood, the floor covered with something warmer than bare metal, a small stove casting a glow into the dim space. These thoughts felt almost dangerous, like tempting fate, because reality had a way of crushing such fragile visions. Yet they kept returning, stubborn as weeds. One particularly cold evening, after returning from a day of wandering aimlessly in search of work, Marcus sat in the container with a candle flickering on a makeshift stand, just an upturned crate he'd found. The small flame threw long, restless shadows across the walls, and in that light he saw not the rust and dents, but the shape of a room that could be. It wasn't much, just the outline of what might one day be a home, but it was enough to stir something in him. It was in that moment that the ridicule began to lose a little of its power. The laughter, the photos, the whispers, none of it was going to change the fact that he had nowhere else to go. If this box was all he had, then it would have to become more than a box. It would have to become something that could stand against the cold, the damp, and the indifference of the world outside. He didn't yet know how he would do it, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't give the people who mocked him the satisfaction of seeing him driven out. As another night closed in, the wind rattling the container like a taunt, Marcus lay down on his mat, pulled his coat tightly around himself, and stared into the dark. Somewhere in that dark, the ember of resolve glowed faintly, waiting for its chance to catch fire. The container might have been the subject of laughter today, but one day, if he could find the strength, it would be something they wouldn't laugh at. By the time sleep finally came, thin and restless as ever, the idea had already begun to take root. And though he woke the next morning to the same cold walls and the same indifferent sky, something in him had shifted. The box would not defeat him. The cold would not drive him out. If he had to build a home from rust and scraps, then that was what he would do. The morning after he made that quiet promise to himself, the air was crisp with the brittle edge of late winter, and the light outside was thin and pale. Marcus rose from his mat, feeling the stiffness in his back and legs. But there was a different kind of weight in him now, something more purposeful than the aimless heaviness he had been carrying for weeks. The laughter and whispers of the past days still lingered in his memory, but instead of stinging, they seemed to push him forward. He stepped outside, his boots crunching against the frost-hardened ground, and looked at the container with a kind of grim determination. The rusted, dented walls didn't look any warmer or more welcoming than they had the day before, but now he saw them as a blank canvas rather than a prison cell. The lot stretched wide around him, fringed by the skeletal remains of weeds and grass that had fought through the concrete cracks. Beyond the fence, the backs of warehouses loomed, their loading docks deserted. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn moaned, deep and mournful. Marcus shoved his hands deep into his coat pockets and started walking. He had no precise destination in mind, only the knowledge that if this metal box was going to become something livable, he would need materials, anything that could seal out the cold, soften the hard edges, and carve some semblance of comfort into the space. The industrial district was full of forgotten corners and discarded remnants. Marcus had walked these streets before, but now he moved through them with a scavenger's eye. Behind a collapsed fence near an old construction site, he found a pile of wooden planks, weathered but still solid. Some were warped, some cracked, but with patience and a saw they could become wall panels or even furniture. He tested their weight in his hands, then set them aside in a neat pile for later retrieval. Further along, behind a half-demolished building, he discovered a stack of discarded insulation boards, some with jagged edges where they had been torn from walls. They were grimy and stained, but he could already imagine them lining the thin steel of the container, blunting the night chill that seeped in through every seam. A broken shopping cart lay nearby, and with some effort he managed to wrench it upright and wheel the insulation back toward the lot. The cart squealed and rattled over every bump, and by the time he reached the container, his hands were raw from gripping the cold metal handle. But the sight of the insulation stacked against the wall was its own small victory. That first day's haul was meager, but it was a start. The next morning, he set out again, pushing deeper into the forgotten pockets of the city. Near the edge of a scrapyard, he spoke briefly with a man sorting through a bin of metal offcuts. Marcus asked if there were any materials bound for the dumpster that he might take. The man eyed him warily, then pointed to a pile of old window frames leaning against a shed. The glass was intact in two of them, clouded but unbroken. Marcus thanked him, lifting the frames carefully onto his shoulder, each step homeward heavy but determined. By the third day of searching, his small collection of materials had begun to look like the beginnings of a plan. Planks of wood, insulation, window frames, even a few battered sheets of corrugated metal that could serve as patchwork siding. Inside the container, he began clearing the floor of debris, bits of rust, dirt, and small stones that had gathered in the corners. He swept until the hollow sound of the broom bristles against the steel floor was almost satisfying. The first real change came when he began to line the walls with insulation. The boards were uneven, and he had to cut them with a handsaw borrowed from a man at the auto yard, trading him a day's help moving tires in exchange. Working inside the container was awkward. Every strike of the saw echoed back at him, and fine particles of dust caught in his throat. But with each board nailed into place, the space felt a fraction less like a frozen shell. He wedged the pieces tight into the corners, sealing over the jagged seams where the steel plates met. Once the insulation was in place, he began fastening the wooden planks over it, using whatever nails and screws he could scrounge. Some planks bore the marks of their previous lives, faint traces of paint, rusted hinges, or the ghostly outlines of stenciled letters. But Marcus didn't mind. They gave the place a texture, a history. The scent of the wood, faint and dry, lingered in the air long after he set down his tools each evening. The floor came next. The cold steel beneath him had been a constant reminder of the container's harshness, leaching warmth from his body even through blankets and mats. From an abandoned house slated for demolition, he salvaged a bundle of old parquet tiles. Some were chipped, others stained, but when laid side by side they formed a patchwork that turned the floor into something more inviting. On his knees, he arranged them carefully, the muted browns and golds softening the starkness of the interior. Still, no amount of insulation or wood could keep out the deep bite of winter nights without a source of heat. For days, Marcus kept his eyes open for anything that might serve, until at last, in the back corner of a scrapyard, he spotted a small, rusted wood-burning stove. The door hung loose on its hinges, and the stovepipe was missing, but the firebox was intact. The owner of the yard agreed to let it go for next to nothing after Marcus spent an afternoon helping to sort a tangle of old copper wire and steel rods. Back at the container, he set about restoring the stove. With sandpaper, he scrubbed away the worst of the rust, reattached the door, and patched a section of the firebox with a piece of scrap metal. He fashioned a stovepipe from two mismatched lengths of tubing he had found, sealing the joints with wire and scrap sheet metal before cutting a small hole in the container's wall to vent the smoke. It was crude, but on the first night he lit a fire inside, the transformation was immediate. The flames cast a warm, flickering light that painted the walls gold and filled the air with a dry, comforting heat. That night, as he sat on the floor with his back against the newly lined wall, Marcus listened to the wind outside and felt it for the first time as something distant, unable to touch him. The cold no longer gnawed at his bones. He fed another log into the stove, watching the embers shift and glow, and felt the first stirrings of pride in what he had built so far. The laughter of strangers and the sting of their mockery hadn't disappeared from his memory, but they no longer felt as sharp. In their place was the slow, steady burn of purpose. He knew there was still a long way to go. The container was far from finished, and the world outside hadn't changed its opinion of him overnight. But inside, for those few hours with the fire crackling and the warmth spreading through the space, it didn't matter. For the first time since he had stood on the curb watching strangers carry his life out of his home, Marcus felt a glimmer of control over his future. The steel walls around him no longer felt like a dead end. They were, at last, the beginning of something. The fire had changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself lingering inside the container for longer stretches, no longer driven out into the streets just to escape the bitter cold. The warmth softened the air, made the metal walls feel less like the sides of a coffin and more like the boundaries of a room that might one day be truly his. Sitting in the glow of the stove, he began to imagine what it would take to turn the container into more than just a shelter. The idea wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about living. He started with the layout. Until then, everything he owned had been piled in one corner, a tangle of bags, scavenged blankets, and odds and ends. Now he began to divide the space in his mind. The back would be his sleeping area, where the warmth from the stove would reach most easily. The middle could be for working and storage, a place to keep tools and the materials he continued to gather. Near the doors, he envisioned a small kitchen. Nothing grand, just a place to prepare food without crouching over an open can. He measured the container by pacing it, the hollow thud of his boots against the parquet-covered floor echoing in the enclosed space, and made mental notes of where each piece would go. The hunt for materials took on new urgency. He combed through the industrial district and the residential edges beyond it, sometimes walking for hours before spotting something useful. From behind a shuttered furniture store, he hauled away a pair of broken wooden pallets. He dismantled them carefully, prying out the nails and sanding the splintered edges until he could reassemble them into a low platform bed. For the first time in months, his sleeping mat was off the floor, and the difference in comfort was astonishing. From a pile of discarded crates, he built a set of shelves, stacking them neatly against one wall to hold his food, tools, and a few battered books that had somehow stayed with him through all the moves and losses. He lined the shelves with scraps of fabric he found in a dumpster behind a tailor's shop, the faded patterns adding a touch of warmth to the otherwise rough wood. Even the smallest details began to matter. A tin mug placed just so, a folded blanket draped over the foot of the bed. Lighting came next. The stove's glow was enough for the evenings he spent sitting close to it, but he needed more than firelight if he was going to spend real time inside. For days, he kept an eye out for solar panels, and finally he found two small, weather-beaten ones leaning against the wall of a pawn shop. The owner was willing to let them go in exchange for Marcus repairing the hinges on the shop's back door. It took him most of the afternoon, but by evening he had the panels strapped to the roof of the container, connected to a car battery he'd salvaged from a junkyard. When the first small LED light flickered on inside, it felt like a miracle. Gentle, steady illumination that made the space feel alive after dark. The kitchen was the most challenging part. Without plumbing, he needed a way to handle water that didn't involve trudging outside in all weather. He found an old metal sink in the corner of a salvage yard, its enamel chipped but intact. A length of rubber hose served as a makeshift tap connected to a 5-gallon water jug perched on a shelf above. For drainage, he rigged a second hose that led outside through a small hole in the wall. A wooden countertop came together from a door he found propped against a fence, on its surface sanded down until it was smooth enough to work on. Slowly, the front corner of the container began to look like a place where meals could be made, not just consumed cold from a can. With each improvement, Marcus felt the walls closing in less. The space began to take on his rhythm, his scent, his order. He found an old curtain rod and hung a sheet between the sleeping area and the rest of the container, creating the illusion of separate rooms. Above the bed, he tacked a strip of fabric patterned with bright red and yellow flowers, a burst of color that made the cold gray steel vanish in that corner. The changes didn't go unnoticed. Passers-by, who once glanced only to sneer, now slowed down as they walked past. They craned their necks toward the open doors, catching glimpses of the order and care inside. Marcus kept working, not for their approval, but because every nail he drove in, every board he sanded, every object he placed just so was a quiet declaration. This is mine, and I am not leaving. Evenings were different now. The stove's warmth spread more evenly through the partitioned space. The shelves stood stocked with what little he could afford, and the bed, though humble, was a place of genuine rest. He could sit at his makeshift table by the kitchen corner, sipping hot tea brewed over the stove, and feel something close to peace. The wind still howled outside on some nights, rattling the walls, but inside there was a sense of calm, as if the container had begun to shield not just his body, but his spirit. As he lay in bed one night, the LED light casting a soft glow across the curtain, Marcus realized that the container no longer felt like the place he had been mocked for living in. It had become a reflection of him, resilient, weathered, but undeniably alive. The transformation wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but the difference between what it had been and what it was now was proof enough that the laughter and derision of strangers didn't define him. He was building something, piece by piece, and for the first time in a long while, he was certain it would last. By the time the interior of the container had begun to resemble a home, Marcus found himself looking at its exterior with a different set of eyes. The warmth, the shelves, the bed, and the faint smell of tea in the evenings made the inside a place of rest, but from the outside, it still looked like what it had been on the first day, a dented, rusted metal box sitting alone on a barren lot. If a stranger passed by without looking inside, they would never know the care and work he had poured into it. They would see only the surface, the flaking paint, the streaks of rust running down from the seams like old scars, and assume nothing had changed. That bothered him more than he expected. Not because he craved the approval of others, but because the contrast between what it was inside and what it seemed outside felt wrong, like wearing clean clothes beneath a ragged coat. He began by standing at a distance from the container, studying its shape and lines as if it were a piece of furniture he was restoring. The color was uneven, patches of faded blue here, bare metal there, the brown-orange of rust showing through in jagged blooms. The doors sagged slightly on their hinges, and the ground at the base was littered with weeds and bits of debris that the wind had carried from the street. In the low winter light, the container looked tired, neglected, and alone. Painting it became his first goal. He didn't have the money to buy new paint in large quantities, but over the course of several days, he managed to gather half-used cans from a variety of places: construction sites, back rooms of small hardware stores, even a donation from a man who had been repainting his fence and had no need for what was left. The colors didn't match at first glance, but Marcus learned to blend them in a bucket, stirring until they came together into a warm, earthy shade with just enough brightness to stand out against the gray of the lot. On the first morning of painting, he worked slowly, brushing carefully around the seams and corners, smoothing the strokes until the metal no longer looked raw but sealed and cared for. The scent of fresh paint filled the air, and for the first time, the container seemed to belong to its space, not just occupy it. Passers-by glanced over more often, some slowing their steps as they noticed the change. A few even nodded as they walked past, a silent acknowledgement that perhaps this place was more than they had thought. Once the paint was done, Marcus turned his attention to the entrance. Until now, the only way in was to step up onto the narrow steel lip of the container, a maneuver that could be awkward, especially with arms full of supplies. Using planks salvaged from a demolished porch, he built a small set of steps leading to the door. Each board was sanded smooth and fastened tightly, and when he was done, he stood on them for a long moment, looking at the door from this new angle. It made a difference. No more awkward climbing, just a simple, welcoming approach. The idea for a veranda came next. It started as a thought while he was sitting outside one afternoon, the stove inside sending thin trails of smoke into the air. The front of the container was bare, functional, and uninviting. With a few sturdy posts and some corrugated roofing panels he found behind a warehouse, he fashioned a small overhang that sheltered the doorway. It wasn't large, but it was enough to stand under when the rain came, enough to make the entrance feel like something more than a hatch in a wall. Around the steps, Marcus began to clear the ground. The weeds and trash were replaced with a few carefully arranged stones, and then he started to plant. It began with just 2 clay pots he found abandoned near a fence, each holding a struggling plant. He nursed them back to health, and soon the area grew to include small beds of flowers edged with bricks, a handful of herbs and repurposed tins, and a few hardy shrubs. He shaped the space as he went, adding what he found or was given, until the front of the container no longer bled into the empty lot, but stood framed by greenery and color. He even thought of light. From a clearance bin at a discount store, he bought a handful of small solar-powered lanterns, the kind meant for garden paths. In the evenings, they lined the short walkway he had cleared, their soft glow marking the way to the door. It was a small thing, but at night, when he returned from a trip into town, the lights felt like they were welcoming him back, guiding him to the place he had made his own. It wasn't long before people began to notice the changes in Ernest. Some of the same faces that had once laughed now stopped to watch him work, curiosity softening their expressions. A woman, walking her dog, paused to tell him the flowers looked beautiful. A delivery driver slowed his van and called out that the paint job was impressive. These weren't deep conversations, but they were cracks in the wall of isolation that had surrounded him since the day he'd moved in. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast a golden light across the lot, Marcus sat on the steps and looked at the container. The paint gleamed softly, the plants swayed in the breeze, and the little lights were beginning to flicker on one by one. It was still humble, still small, but no longer looked temporary or makeshift. It looked like a home, his home, rooted in this spot with quiet dignity. Inside, the shelves and bed and kitchen were exactly as he had arranged them, but now when he stepped out and closed the door behind him, the sight that greeted him matched the feeling he carried within. The transformation outside had not only changed how others saw the container, it had changed how he saw himself in it. It was no longer a hiding place from the cold and the rain. It was a place to arrive at, a place to care for, a place that gave back some of the stability he had lost. And, as the last of the evening light faded, Marcus realized that the laughter and scorn from those early days had gone quiet. The container that had once been a target for mockery was becoming something else entirely, a point of quiet respect, even if unspoken. It made him wonder, not without a flicker of pride, what might come next. The weeks that followed the transformation of the container's exterior brought a shift so gradual that Marcus almost didn't notice it at first. The days still began with the same routines: waking early, stoking the fire, stepping out to check the small plants and sweep away any debris the wind had carried in overnight. But there was a difference in the air. The passers-by who once avoided meeting his eyes now lingered for a moment, offering a nod or a few words. Some even stopped to comment on the flowers or the paintwork, gestures so small yet so foreign to his life here that they left him momentarily unsure how to respond. One late morning, as he was repainting a section of the steps where the wood had begun to fade under the sun, a man with a camera slung over his shoulder approached. He introduced himself as a journalist from the local paper and explained that he had been driving past the lot for months, watching the changes unfold. He asked if Marcus would be willing to tell his story. Marcus hesitated, wary of strangers pointing lenses at him, but something in the man's tone convinced him this wasn't mockery disguised as curiosity. They sat on the steps while Marcus recounted how he had come to the lot, the early days of cold and ridicule, and the work he had done to make the container livable. The journalist listened without interrupting, occasionally glancing at the flowers or the small veranda, as if trying to absorb the full picture. A week later, the story appeared in the paper with a photograph of Marcus standing by the steps, the container glowing in the late afternoon light behind him. The headline spoke not of desperation or poverty, but of determination and ingenuity. It was strange to see his face in print, stranger still to read the kind words written about what he had built. For years, the public gaze had been something to avoid, a thing that brought shame or judgment. Now it felt different, tentative but not hostile. The article spread further than he expected. A local blogger shared it online, and from there it was picked up by a few community pages. People began arriving at the lot not just to pass by, but to visit. Some came with questions about how he had managed certain repairs. Others brought things they thought might help: a box of nails, a bundle of wood, a roll of weatherproof fabric. One woman arrived with a potted plant and placed it by the steps without saying much more than, "I thought this would look nice here." With the visitors came a steady trickle of conversation. Marcus found himself speaking more than he had in months, explaining how he had insulated the walls, or where he had found the sink, or how the solar lights worked. He realized that people weren't just curious about the container, they were curious about the man who had refused to let it remain what it had been. Some of them admitted, a little sheepishly, that they had been skeptical at first, even dismissive. One man confessed that he had been among those who laughed. "I didn't think it would work," he said, "but it's something. what you've done here." The help that came was never asked for, but it was accepted with quiet gratitude. A retired carpenter offered to help reinforce the veranda roof. A young couple brought over a small bench they no longer needed, which Marcus placed beside the steps so visitors could sit for a while. The small garden grew with each contribution. Bright bursts of color in pots, herbs in recycled containers, a climbing plant that began to wind itself along the edge of the veranda. These gestures didn't erase the memory of the early ridicule, but they dulled its sting. The laughter that had once echoed in his mind was replaced by the murmur of friendly voices, the clink of mugs when someone stopped to share tea, the sound of neighbors greeting him by name. The container, once a solitary object on an empty lot, was becoming something woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. One evening, after a day of small repairs and planting, Marcus stood by the fence that edged the lot and looked out at the street. The setting sun cast long shadows, and the solar lanterns along the path had begun to glow. He saw a family pause at the gate, the children pointing toward the flowers, the parents smiling. He realized that people were no longer just looking at a container. They were looking at a home, at a testament to what could be made from little more than persistence and care. Inside, the changes were subtler but just as real. He no longer felt the constant need to guard against intrusion. Instead, he welcomed the knock at the door, the curious visitor, the neighbor who stopped by with a spare tool. The container felt bigger somehow, as if the goodwill of others had stretched its walls. It wasn't only his anymore. It had become a point of shared pride for those who had watched it grow into what it was. That night, sitting at his small table with the stove's fire casting a warm light on the curtain, Marcus thought about the distance between the man who had shivered on the metal floor that first night and the man who now sat here. The journey wasn't finished, but the path had shifted. He had moved from being the object of ridicule to someone people came to see, not out of pity, but out of respect. It was a quiet, steady change, and it made him wonder what else might be possible. The container had become more than a shelter. It was a message, one he had written with every nail, every brushstroke of paint, every plant set in the soil. And now, with others adding to it in their own ways, that message was no longer just his. It belonged to the small community that had grown up around him, proof that even the most unassuming place could hold more than anyone expected, if given the chance. By the time spring had settled fully over the city, the container bore little resemblance to the battered steel box that had been dropped on the lot months before. The paint still caught the evening light in warm tones. The flowers by the steps had multiplied and bloomed into vibrant reds and yellows, and the shrubs at the edges of the property had grown thick enough to offer a soft boundary between the little sanctuary and the rest of the world. Marcus moved through the space with the ease of someone who no longer measured his steps against the cold or the draft. It was his home now in every sense of the word, a place where each detail bore the imprint of his hands and his decisions. The change was more than physical. The unease that had lived in his chest for so long, that restless feeling of waiting for the next blow, had given way to something steadier. Each morning, he opened the door to the scent of earth and wood, to the sight of the solar lanterns blinking off as the sun rose, to the knowledge that this place, this unlikely home, would still be here when he returned at the end of the day. He no longer glanced over his shoulder to see if someone was watching, no longer braced himself for a cutting remark as he stepped outside. The laughter from those first weeks had faded into a distant echo, replaced by the quiet rhythms of his work and the gentle interruptions of visitors who had come to see the container not as a joke, but as a small triumph. It was in those quieter days that Marcus began to understand just how much the project had anchored him. The container had been, at first, a desperate choice, a last patch of ground to stand on when everything else had been taken away. But through the months of labor, it had become a reflection of who he was, a man who could take something abandoned and unwanted and turn it into something that drew people in. There was a kind of dignity in that, one that didn't depend on anyone's permission or approval. He spent his mornings tending the garden, adding new plants to fill the spaces between the older ones, rearranging pots so the colors would catch the light differently. On some days, he worked on small improvements inside, repainting the shelves, replacing the curtain between the sleeping area and the kitchen with a sturdier fabric, repairing the handle on the stove. Each change was a small act of care, a way of reminding himself that the work was never truly finished, that there was always something worth refining. From time to time, he would catch sight of people pausing at the fence to look in, their expressions curious but warm. Sometimes they waved, and he would wave back. A few braver ones came closer, asking about the flowers or the construction, and he would invite them to step onto the veranda, to see for themselves what he had built. These moments didn't feel like intrusions anymore. They felt like small exchanges of trust. One evening, as the sun slid low over the warehouses and painted the lot in deep gold, Marcus sat on the steps with a mug of tea and let his gaze wander over the scene before him. The solar lights along the path began to glow, one after another, as if waking up in greeting. The air carried the faint scent of the herbs he had planted by the door, and somewhere nearby children's laughter floated in on the breeze. He thought about the man he had been on that first night here, curled on the cold metal floor, and the man he was now, sitting in the warm light of a home he had made with his own hands. The distance between those two versions of himself was measured not just in time, but in every nail hammered, every plank sanded, every seed planted. It struck him then that the container had become more than a solution to his need for shelter. It had become the proof that he could start again, that loss didn't have to be the final word. In the stillness of that evening, he realized that the fear of losing everything had loosened its hold on him. He had already lost it once, and from the wreckage he had built something new. If it ever happened again, he knew now that he could begin once more. The sounds of the city were a distant hum beyond the shrubs, softened by the cocoon he had created here. Marcus leaned back against the doorframe and watched the last light fade from the sky, the outlines of the garden settling into shadow. The lantern's glow cast gentle circles on the path, guiding the way to the door as they always did. It was a simple view, but to him it was as complete and full as any grand landscape could be. He finished his tea, set the mug aside, and let the evening settle around him. The container was quiet inside, the stove banked for the night, the air faintly warm. Tomorrow there would be more to do, repairs to make, plants to tend, perhaps a visitor or two to greet, but for now there was nothing urgent, nothing pulling him away from this moment. In the stillness, Marcus understood that he had found more than a roof and four walls. He had found the weight of belonging, the steadiness of knowing he had shaped a place with his own hands and will. And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky above the lot, he smiled to himself, thinking that for all the twists and losses that had brought him here, this was a place worth arriving at, and worth keeping. The container had once been a cold, empty shell. Now it was home, and in its quiet, unassuming way, it had given him back his life. Subscribe to the channel, watch more of our videos, and share this one with your friends.